Ruth Maguire, Equalities and Human Rights.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. First Minister, just a few months ago, Jackie Kay, the Scots Macker, said that Scotland had to grow up about racism. She commented that the history of slavery is not part of Scotland's national curriculum, so there is widespread ignorance across the country of its active role in slavery. Last month, CRER, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, wrote an open letter to our Parliament criticising the lack of focus on race over the past 20 years. They looked at chamber debates and the work of committees and have found that overall race is discussed much less now than it was in the early days of Parliament. For example, over the past 2 decades, there have been only 5 chamber debates on race alone, with an 11-year gap between a debate on race equality led by the Minister for Communities in June 2006 and one held in December 2017 led by the Cabinet Secretary for Communities, Social Security and Equalities. They rightly question why that is. Could it be the joining of the equality strands into the Equalities Act 2010, or the lack of BME representation in our Parliament, or is it because the Scottish Government is not undertaking work that can be scrutinised? 2 decades later, BME groups still experience significant inequalities and disparities in all areas of public life in Scotland, from employment to housing to education and justice. And nearly a quarter of people living in Scotland believe there is sometimes a good reason to be prejudiced against certain groups. They ask, and I'm asking you, First Minister, isn't this Scotland 20 years on entitled to strong leadership from politicians and an acknowledgement that racism exists in our institutions and structures?
First Minister.
Well, I would never seek to suggest that racism doesn't exist in Scotland in broader society as well as in different institutions. I believe it does, and I believe we all have an obligation, a very serious obligation, to both acknowledge that and to tackle it. There are many different issues that have kind of been thrown up by your question, which I'll try to run through as quickly as possible. The Scottish Government does a great deal of work around equality generally and different aspects of equality. I'd be happy to look at whether we could bring a particular debate to Parliament, although I do think this is more fundamental than that in many different respects. You talk about BME representation in Parliament, which is something that I think we have got, a mountain of work still to do around, and that's for all of our respective political parties to take seriously, and we've all got work to do on that. There are still a number of barriers to BME communities in terms of access to services, in terms of employment that need to be dealt with systematically. And then I suppose more generally, and it's something that I will not be alone in feeling a discomfort about. So I don't think at any point over the past 20 years could we ever have confidently said we've dealt with the issue of racism in Scotland. I think that complacency would always have been completely misplaced and wrong. And I should say, I think Jackie Kay was right to jolt everybody out of any kind of sense of complacency around this. But nevertheless, I think there is a sense in more recent times that progress that not just Scotland but maybe across the UK and further afield that we had sort of taken for granted we had made, and that things were going in the right direction, that all of us have had cause to question whether that is actually the case, and whether I definitely think there is a sense of renewed licence that some people feel to articulate racist attitudes and to voice racist slurs, and the general sort of, and I'm absolutely not pointing the finger at anybody or any political party, but the general tenor of our political debate, I think, risks taking us back the way here. So I don't think we should ever have been complacent over the past 20 years, but I absolutely think now is a time where we really have to look ourselves very hard in the mirror and decide that this is something we have to collectively give much more priority and leadership to.
Yeah. Yes, no, that was a nod. Proceed. I was being too subtle. I'm not good at subtle. Okay. Yes.
First Minister, Clare have also written to my committee and asked us to scrutinise the Scottish Government's Race Equality Action Plan following the publication of a Year 1 progress update. And we'll be doing this in the next few weeks. As you know, the action plan covers a range of themes: employment, health, housing, participation and representation, and community cohesion. Can I ask what oversight you have of the action plan, and are you content or concerned with its current progress?
First Minister.
We monitor progress carefully. So in terms of the oversight within government, and the Race Equality Action Plan is, you know, but for the benefit of everybody else here, sets out the actions that we will take during the current parliamentary term. We appointed Kaliani Lyle as our independent race equality advisor back in 2017 to provide both advice and challenge to help us advance race equality and tackle racism. So in some respects, the action plan responds directly to the recommendations that she has made. In the 2 years since it was published, I think some progress has been made, but there is still a lot to do. In terms of the oversight within government, there is a programme board that is chaired by the Director General for Education, Communities and Justice, with a strong governance structure in place. The next update report is due, I think, in March 2020, so very soon, which will set out the progress that has been made and what work is underway to take forward actions in the areas where we've still got work to do. And I think the scrutiny that you've talked about today that your committee will apply will be a useful part of that process.
Do you have another question?
I have another 2 questions. If
Oh,
that's okay.
another 2. I don't know. We'll
I'm
hear the
still in
next one
time.
anyway then.
First Minister, a further open letter on race and racism. It was signed by 80 signatories, which included activists, community workers, academics and educators, drew attention to the difference between colour-based racism and racism faced by white migrant groups. And it called for discussions on race to, and I'll quote them here if I may, recognise that whilst discrimination and xenophobia faced by white migrant groups must be tackled, for most of these groups this will reduce over generations. The perception of whiteness will eventually confer an advantage, and at the very least the advantage of freedom from the impact of skin colour based on stereotypes, prejudice and hatred. The letter asks that those with influence, including politicians, seek to understand race and racism beyond legal definitions in the Equality Act, which, as you'll know, protects people from discrimination on grounds of colour, nationality and ethnic or national origins. The open letter calls for evidence-based policy approaches to take account of the history of racialisation and the current experience of discrimination, which creates worse outcomes for people from specific ethnic backgrounds in specific areas of life. Can I ask what your response is to the signatories of this letter, and if you think it's fair criticism of the Scottish Government and indeed other institutions in Scotland? And just in case the Deputy Presiding Officer doesn't let me back in.
Excuse me. No, that's your question. And then I was just, if you'll bear with me, because we do have time, I was going to let you ask that,
Okay.
and I'm going to let other people in. I've got a supplementary from Bob, then we go on, Bob Doris, then we go on to open supplementaries, and you could come in then.
Okay.
So don't over-egg it.
Okay.
I'd be very happy to look personally at the letter that has the 80 signatories and take very seriously, if there hasn't been a response from the government yet, make sure that there is a detailed response to that. I think, so obviously I'd want to consider it before responding in detail to whether I thought criticisms, and because I don't know exactly what the criticisms are entirely fair. In general, though, I think it raises a really important issue that we do have to understand racism and discrimination in its historical context, but also in its current context, how different people and different groups experience discrimination. I've got a very strong interest in this from my own constituency experience. In my constituency in the south side of Glasgow, there is a very large, now well-established immigrant population from Pakistan and India, smaller African immigrant population, but also a more recent immigrant population from Eastern European countries. So there is already there obvious signs of the different experiences of discrimination, but also how in some cases that will erode over time, in others it will be less likely to. So I think we must both understand this in all of that multi-layered complexity, but also make sure that our responses to it reflect that. And I'm very keen to respond, to engage with the signatories of that letter to make sure that the action plans and the actions that we are taking forward are geared to reflect that complexity.
And lastly, and I hope briefly, Ms Maguire.
Thank you. First Minister, I just wanted to finish by asking what your message is to BME members of our community here in Scotland that feel that progress on equality and removing those systematic barriers that we spoke about is painstakingly slow. And would you agree that the criticisms that we discussed earlier should shame us all into action?
First Minister.
I think as long as we have a situation where any part of our broader community in Scotland faces discrimination, prejudice, racism or systematic barriers to fulfilling their potential, then we should all take that as a personal responsibility. As First Minister, I recognise my very special responsibility to show leadership there. So my message is that they should see me and the Scottish Government as an ally in this, and that our door is open to ensuring that we have the right dialogue and conversations to do the things that we need to do. I think representation is not the only part of this, but I think it is a big part of this. That takes us more into the political sphere. But, you know, I would say, it's the third time I think I've mentioned my constituency experience. I think there might be some challenge on this. I think I represent the most diverse constituency in the whole of the country. So I see many of these issues up close on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And I hope that gives me a deeper understanding, but it also makes me more determined that we address these issues, no matter how difficult they are, no matter how complex. We have to give meaning to what I think all of us want to see in Scotland, which is a country where people are valued for who they are, regardless of where they come from or the colour of their skin.